The 1960s were the decade that gave birth to the American muscle car, a time when horsepower was cheap, gasoline cost pennies per gallon, and safety regulations were something engineers laughed about over lunch. Detroit was locked in an arms race where cubic inches and quarter-mile times were the only currencies that mattered. The result was a collection of machines so powerful, so primitive, and so willing to kill their drivers that they defined an entire generation's relationship with speed and danger. These weren't transportation. They were weapons disguised as automobiles, built in an era when survival depended entirely on skill, courage, and luck. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1960s. The machines that proved American engineers could build anything, even if nobody could actually drive it safely. Number 12, the 1967 Pontiac Firebird 400. Pontiac's answer to the Mustang arrived late to the pony car party, but it made an impression. The Firebird 400 took GM's mid-size muscle car engine and crammed it into a compact platform that was never designed to handle that much power. The 6.6-liter V8 made 325 horsepower and 410 pound-feet of torque, which doesn't sound apocalyptic by today's standards. But in a car that weighed around 3,300 pounds with primitive bias-ply tires and no electronic aids, it was more than enough to get you into serious trouble. The Firebird could hit 60 miles per hour in around 6.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-14-second range. What made it dangerous was the chassis. GM had designed the F body platform for handling with smaller engines, and the suspension geometry simply wasn't optimized for the weight and power of the 400. The front end was nose-heavy, which caused severe understeer when entering corners. But lift off the throttle mid-corner to try to tighten your line, and suddenly, all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be in a drift, whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick for the era, just over 3 turns lock to lock, but it lacked feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing until they were already sliding. The brakes were drums all around on base models, which meant stopping distances were measured in optimism rather than feet. Even with the optional front disc brakes, fade set in quickly during aggressive driving. The Firebird 400 taught thousands of young drivers that looking fast and being controllable weren't the same thing. It was a car that invited you to drive aggressively with its aggressive styling and powerful engine, then punished you for accepting that invitation. Number 11, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 383. Dodge took their compact Dart platform and stuffed it full of big block power, creating one of the most ill-mannered muscle cars of the 60s. The 383 cubic inch V8 made 330 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. Installed in a car that weighed barely 3,200 pounds, the power-to-weight ratio was impressive, and the performance numbers reflected it. The Dart GTS could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But the chassis was completely overwhelmed. The Dart was built on Chrysler's A-body platform, which was designed for economy cars with 6-cylinder engines. The suspension had minimal travel, the shock absorbers were undersized, and the frame rails weren't reinforced to handle the twisting forces of big block torque. The result was a car that would literally twist its body under hard acceleration. Panel gaps would change, doors would become difficult to open, and the whole structure would flex like it was trying to fold itself in half. The front suspension geometry was primitive, with torsion bars that allowed the nose to dive dramatically under braking. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem. Launch hard, and the rear axle would wind up the leaf springs like a torsion bar. When the tires finally broke loose, all that stored energy would release at once, causing the rear end to hop and skip violently. The steering was slow and vague, which made precise control impossible. And the brakes were marginal at best, drums all around unless you ordered the expensive front disc option. The Dart GTS proved that putting a big engine in a small car created performance, but not necessarily drivability. It was a car that could accelerate like a rocket, but steered like a shopping cart and stopped like an oil tanker. The weight distribution was also problematic, with the heavy big block sitting far forward in the chassis. That made the car nose-heavy and prone to plowing straight ahead in corners, no matter how much you turned the steering wheel. Number 10. The 1969 Ford Torino Cobra 429. Ford's midsize muscle car entry was built to compete with the Chevelle and GTO, and they didn't hold back. The Torino Cobra came standard with Ford's 429 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8, which officially made 375 horsepower. But like all Ford big block ratings of the era, that number was pure fiction. Real output was closer to 450 horses, with torque numbers exceeding 500 pound-feet. The Cobra could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were serious numbers that put it in the same performance league as cars, costing much more. But the Torino's size and weight made it a handful. At over 3,800 pounds, this was a heavy car with serious momentum. The long hood and short deck proportions meant forward visibility was compromised, especially during hard acceleration when the front end would lift. The chassis was typical Ford, body-on-frame construction with a solid rear axle and leaf springs. The suspension was tuned more for ride comfort than handling precision, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. Turn the steering wheel, and the car would lean heavily to the outside before the front tires actually started changing direction. The delay between input and response made precise driving impossible, and the rear suspension had a tendency to allow axle wrap during hard acceleration. The leaf springs would wind up as torque tried to rotate the axle, and when the tires finally broke loose, the springs would unwind violently, causing wheel hop that could break rear axle components. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was better than many competitors, but they still weren't up to the task of repeatedly hauling this nearly 2-ton beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few hard applications. The Torino Cobra was a car that felt stable and planted at cruising speeds, which gave drivers false confidence. Then, they'd push hard and discover that stability disappeared the moment you asked for maximum performance. The body-on-frame construction also meant the chassis would flex and twist under hard use, with the body separating slightly from the frame. You could hear creaks and groans during aggressive cornering as the structure worked against itself. Number 9. The 1967 Chevrolet Camaro SS 396. Chevrolet's pony car response to the Mustang came equipped with genuine big block power and SS trim. The 396 cubic inch V8 made 325 horsepower in base form, but the L78 version with the higher compression ratio and better breathing components made 375 horses. That was enough to make the 3,300-pound Camaro genuinely quick. Quarter-mile times came in the mid-13s, and 60 miles per hour arrived in under 6 seconds. But the first-generation Camaro had quirks that made it dangerous in inexperienced hands. The unibody construction was less rigid than body-on-frame competitors, which meant the chassis would flex under hard cornering or acceleration. You could actually see the cowl twist if you watched carefully during a hard launch. The front suspension used coil springs and unequal length control arms, which was sophisticated for the era. But the geometry wasn't optimized for big block weight, and the front end would plow in tight corners. The rear suspension was a multi-leaf spring setup with a solid axle, and it had a nasty habit of causing the rear end to step out suddenly when you hit a bump mid-corner. The steering was recirculating ball type, which meant it was vague and slow compared to modern rack and pinion systems. You needed nearly 4 full turns to go from lock to lock, and there was significant play in the center position. That made small corrections difficult and large corrections slow. The brakes were optional front discs with rear drums, which was adequate for normal driving but marginal during sustained hard use. The weight distribution was nose-heavy because of that big block engine sitting far forward in the chassis, which meant the front brakes did most of the work. They would fade quickly during aggressive driving, leaving you with rear drums that locked up easily and sent the car spinning. The Camaro SS was a car that looked fantastic, sounded menacing, and went like hell in a straight line. But ask it to turn or stop at speed, and it revealed its limitations quickly. The combination of unibody flex, primitive suspension, and marginal brakes made it a car that demanded respect and skill from its driver. Number 8. The 1969 Mercury Cougar Eliminator 428 Cobra Jet. Mercury's upscale pony car got the full performance treatment with the Eliminator package, and the results were spectacular and terrifying in equal measure. The 428 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8 made 335 horsepower officially, but that was the same engine Ford rated at 335 in everything from Mustangs to Torinos, regardless of actual output. Real power was closer to 400 horses, with torque exceeding 440 pound-feet. The Cougar Eliminator could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in just over 6 seconds. But the Cougar was heavier than the Mustang it was based on, tipping the scales at nearly 3,500 pounds. And that weight came with consequences. The longer wheelbase, 111 inches compared to the Mustang's 108, provided better straight-line stability but made the car feel larger and less agile. The hideaway headlights added weight to the nose, making the front-heavy weight distribution even worse. Mercury marketed the Cougar as a more sophisticated alternative to the Mustang, with a plusher interior and more sound deadening. But all that luxury equipment added weight and dulled the car's responses. The suspension was tuned for a comfortable ride, which meant it wallowed in corners. The steering was slow and overboosted, giving little feedback about what the front tires were doing. And the brakes, while adequate for casual driving, would fade quickly during hard use. The Eliminator package added stiffer springs and shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic physics of a nose-heavy rear-drive car with a solid rear axle and marginal tires. What made the Cougar Eliminator particularly dangerous was that it attracted buyers who wanted performance but also valued comfort and luxury. These weren't hardcore enthusiasts who understood the car's limits. They were people who wanted to look fast and occasionally drive fast, without necessarily having the skills to handle a 400 horsepower rear-drive muscle car. The combination of serious power, comfort-oriented chassis tuning, and inexperienced drivers led to a lot of crashed Cougars. Number 7. The 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner. Plymouth's budget muscle car was designed to deliver maximum performance for minimum money, and it succeeded brilliantly. But it also created one of the most dangerous muscle cars of the era, precisely because it made so much power available to so many young, inexperienced drivers. The base engine was the 383 cubic inch V8, making 335 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. That was enough to propel the 3,500-pound Roadrunner through the quarter mile in the mid-14s. But the real danger came with the optional 440 cubic inch engine, which made 375 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. With that engine, the Roadrunner could run low 14 and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. The problem was that Plymouth stripped the car of everything that didn't make it faster to keep the price down. That meant vinyl seats instead of cloth, rubber floor mats instead of carpet, and most importantly, the cheapest suspension and brakes they could get away with. The front suspension was basic torsion bars with minimal damping. The rear was leaf springs and a solid axle with shocks that were more suggestion than control. The steering was manual unless you paid extra for power assist, which meant it was heavy and slow. And the brakes were drums all around in base form, which meant stopping distances that would be considered criminal today. The Roadrunner was also offered with a 4-speed manual transmission that had widely spaced gears. First gear was extremely low for hard launches, but the jump to second was huge. That meant you had to rev the engine near redline in first, then drop several thousand RPM when shifting to second. If you weren't smooth with the clutch, the rear end would break loose violently during the 1-2 shift, sending inexperienced drivers spinning. Plymouth sold over 44,000 Roadrunners in 1968 alone, which meant these dangerous machines were everywhere. Young buyers could afford them. Insurance companies hadn't figured out how to price them properly yet, and the performance was intoxicating. The combination led to a lot of accidents, a lot of deaths, and eventually to the insurance industry crackdown that helped kill the muscle car era. The Roadrunner became a symbol of accessible performance, but it also became a cautionary tale about making too much power available to drivers who lacked the experience to handle it safely. Number 6. The 1969 Dodge Charger RT Hemi. Dodge's fastback muscle car was beautiful, powerful, and absolutely lethal in the wrong hands. The Charger RT with the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 represented the pinnacle of Mopar muscle, and it came with all the danger that implied. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque officially, but everyone knew those numbers were conservative. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the torque was even more underrated. The Charger Hemi could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 5.5 seconds. Those were supercar numbers in 1969, achieved with an engine that was essentially a race motor with street manners. But the Charger was a big car, over 208 inches long and weighing nearly 3,800 pounds. That size meant it had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The long hood, over 6 feet from bumper to windshield, meant forward visibility was compromised. You couldn't see the front corners of the car, which made parking difficult and low-speed maneuvering hazardous. The unibody construction was stiffer than body-on-frame cars, but it still flexed under the twisting forces of hard acceleration or aggressive cornering. The doors would become difficult to open after hard use, and panel gaps would change as the structure twisted. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was common during hard launches. The Hemi's power delivery made this worse. The engine was docile below 3,000 RPM, then violent above it. There was no gentle transition, just an on-off switch. Below 3,000, you had a heavy, lazy engine that barely made power. Above 3,000, you had 500 horsepower trying to tear the rear axle out of the car. That sudden power delivery meant the rear tires would break loose violently when the engine came on the cam, and if you weren't ready for it, you'd be sideways before you could react. The steering was recirculating ball type, with lots of play and little feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing, which made precise driving impossible. And the brakes, while better than many competitors with standard front discs and rear drums, still weren't up to the task of repeatedly stopping this nearly 2-ton car from triple-digit speeds. The Charger Hemi was a car that made you feel invincible. The styling was aggressive, the sound was menacing, and the acceleration was intoxicating. But it demanded respect and skill, and it punished drivers who had more enthusiasm than ability. The combination of massive power, primitive chassis dynamics, and the Charger's widespread popularity meant these cars were involved in countless accidents throughout the late 60s and early 70s. Number 5. The 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. The L88. Corvette wasn't just dangerous, it was barely street legal. Chevrolet built it for racing, but they had to sell a certain number to qualify for competition homologation. So they created what was essentially a race car with headlights and sold it to anyone with enough money and courage. The 7.0-liter V8 was officially rated at 430 horsepower, but that was a lie so blatant it was almost insulting. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The L88 could run the quarter mile in the low 12s and hit 60 in under 4 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, and this was 1967. But everything about the L88 was compromised for racing. The compression ratio was 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel. Run pump gas, and the engine would destroy itself through detonation. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely ran below 3,000 RPM. The idle was so rough that parts would vibrate loose if you didn't safety wire everything. And there was no heater, no radio, no sound deadening. Nothing that didn't make the car faster. The chassis couldn't handle the power. The C2 Corvette's independent rear suspension was sophisticated for the era, but it used a single transverse leaf spring that allowed the rear wheels to tuck under the body during hard cornering. That sudden camber change would cause the rear end to break loose without warning. The front suspension wasn't much better, with geometry that caused severe understeer at the limit. The brakes were 4-wheel discs, which was excellent for the era, but they were designed for the bass, 327 cubic inch engine, not the monster L88. They would overheat quickly during hard use, and fade was a constant problem. The steering was quick but not communicative, which meant you were always guessing at the limits of traction. Chevrolet only sold 20 L88 Corvettes in 1967, and most went directly to race teams who knew what they were getting into. But a few ended up with wealthy enthusiasts who discovered they'd bought a car that was completely undrivable on the street and terrifying at the track. Number 4, the 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4. Pontiac's wildest GTO combined outrageous styling with genuine performance credentials. The Judge package added bold graphics, a rear wing, and the Ram Air 4 engine option, a 400 cubic inch V8 that made 370 horsepower officially, but over 400 in reality. The Ram Air 4 was built for top-end power, with round port cylinder heads that flowed massive amounts of air and a camshaft with aggressive timing. The result was an engine that made most of its power between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM. Below that range, it was sluggish and lazy. Above it, it was a monster. The GTO Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds. But the power delivery made it tricky to drive. You had to keep the engine in its narrow power band, which required precise shifting and careful throttle modulation. Drop below 4,000 RPM and you'd fall out of the power band, losing momentum. Over-rev past 6,000 and you'd risk damage to the valve train. The chassis was typical GMA body, competent but not exceptional. The suspension used coil springs at all 4 corners, which was more sophisticated than leaf springs, but still allowed significant body roll. The steering was recirculating ball with power assist, which made it light but vague. And the brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was adequate for normal driving but marginal during sustained hard use. What made the Judge particularly dangerous was its image. This was a car that screamed performance, with its loud graphics and aggressive stance. It attracted young buyers who wanted to look fast and sometimes lacked the skills to actually drive fast. The combination of narrow power band, moderate grip, and inexperienced drivers led to a lot of crashed GTOs. The Judge also suffered from quality control issues typical of late 60s GM products. Panel fit was poor, weather sealing was inadequate, and electrical systems were unreliable. Those issues didn't make the car dangerous directly, but they contributed to an ownership experience that was often frustrating. Number 3, the 1968 Ford Mustang Cobra Jet 428. Ford's answer to the big block pony car wars was the Cobra Jet 428, and it redefined what was possible in a compact chassis. The engine was officially rated at 335 horsepower, which was the same rating Ford gave to multiple engines regardless of actual output. The Cobra Jet's real power was closer to 410 horses, with torque exceeding 440 pound-feet. Ford achieved this by taking the 428 cubic inch FE big block and improving everything that mattered for performance. Larger valves improved breathing, better exhaust manifolds reduced back pressure, and a revised camshaft improved the power curve across the rev range. The Mustang Cobra Jet could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in just over 6 seconds. But stuffing a big block into the Mustang's compact engine bay created compromises. The engine sat far forward in the chassis, which made the weight distribution heavily nose-biased. Over 60% of the car's weight was on the front axle, which caused severe understeer. Turn into a corner and the front end would plow straight ahead, pushing wide no matter how much you cranked the steering wheel. The front suspension was simple wishbones and coil springs, and it was overwhelmed by the weight. The spring rates were too soft, the shock absorbers were undersized, and the geometry wasn't optimized for the loads. The result was excessive nosedive under braking and significant body roll during cornering. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which was primitive but functional. However, the spring rates were chosen for ride comfort rather than performance, which meant the rear end would squat dramatically during hard acceleration. That weight transfer helped plant the rear tires, but it also made the front end light and vague, right when you needed steering precision. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was typical for the era. But the front heavy weight distribution meant the front brakes did most of the work, and they would fade quickly during aggressive driving. Once fade set in, stopping distances would nearly double, and the rear drums would lock up easily, sending the car into a spin. The Cobra Jet Mustang was a car that felt fast and looked aggressive, which encouraged spirited driving. But the chassis wasn't designed to handle big block power and weight, and it would bite drivers who pushed beyond its limits. Number 2, the 1969 Plymouth Barracuda, Formula S 383. Plymouth's compact pony car became a serious performance threat with the Formula S package and 383 cubic inch big block engine. The engine made 330 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. Installed in a car that weighed barely 3,200 pounds, the power-to-weight ratio was excellent, and the performance reflected it. The Barracuda could hit 60 in around 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But the compact A-body platform was never designed for big block power. The unibody structure wasn't reinforced enough to handle the twisting forces, which meant the body would flex during hard acceleration or cornering. Doors would become difficult to open, panel gaps would change, and in extreme cases, the windshield could crack from chassis flex. The front suspension used torsion bars and unequal length control arms, which was Chrysler's standard setup. But the spring rates were too soft for the big block's weight, and the front end would dive dramatically under braking. The rear suspension was leaf springs and a solid axle, with the same wheel hop problems that plagued all Mopar muscle cars. Launch hard, and the axle would wind up the leaf springs. When the tires finally broke loose, the stored energy would release violently, causing the rear end to hop and skip. The short wheelbase, just 108 inches, made weight transfer dramatic during acceleration and braking. There was no gentle progression, just sudden, violent shifts that required constant attention and quick corrections. The steering was manual, unless you ordered power assist. And even with power steering, it was heavy and slow at low speeds. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was adequate for a car this light, but fade was still a concern during sustained hard driving. What made the Formula S Barracuda truly dangerous was its size. It looked small and manageable, which gave drivers false confidence, but it had big block power and a chassis that struggled to contain it. The combination led to a lot of inexperienced drivers getting in over their heads, discovering too late that looking nimble and being controllable weren't the same thing. Number 1, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. At the top of our list sits the most extreme, most powerful, and most dangerous muscle car of the 1960s, the Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This wasn't just a high-performance option. It was a race car with license plates, built to dominate drag strips and make Chevrolet the undisputed king of straight-line performance. The ZL1 designation referred to the engine, an all-aluminum 427 cubic inch V8 that was officially rated at 430 horsepower. That number was so laughably conservative that even Chevrolet dealerships knew it was fiction. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The all-aluminum construction meant the engine weighed about 100 pounds less than the cast-iron L72 427, which improved weight distribution and handling while also reducing overall vehicle weight. The ZL1 Camaro could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at over 120 miles per hour. It could hit 60 miles per hour in under 5 seconds. Those were professional drag racing numbers, achieved in a car that was technically street legal. But everything about the ZL1 was extreme. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely made power below 3,000 RPM. The idle was violent and lumpy, shaking the entire car. The compression ratio was over 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel or at minimum high-octane premium. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would destroy itself through pre-ignition and detonation within minutes. The carburetion was a single Holley 4-barrel on an aluminum manifold, tuned for top-end power rather than drivability. Off-idle response was poor, making the car difficult to drive in traffic or at low speeds. But Above 4,000 RPM, the ZL-1 engine transformed into a monster that made power in amounts that should have been impossible for a naturally aspirated engine of that era. The chassis was completely overwhelmed. The first-generation Camaro's unibody structure wasn't designed for this kind of power. The suspension, coil springs up front, leaf springs, and solid axle in the rear was adequate for the base inline-six engine, but hopeless with 600 horsepower. The rear end would break loose at the slightest provocation, and catching a slide required lightning-fast reflexes and expert car control. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was standard for the era, but completely inadequate for a car this fast. Stopping from high speeds required massive distances, and fades set in after just a few hard applications. The steering was quick but not communicative, which meant you were always guessing at the limits of adhesion. What made the ZL-1 Camaro truly legendary and truly dangerous was its rarity and cost. Only 69 were built, and they cost over $7,000, when a standard Camaro could be had for $2,500. That meant only serious racers and wealthy enthusiasts bought them. But even experienced drivers found the ZL-1 to be a handful. The power came on so violently, the traction was so marginal, and the brakes were so inadequate that every drive was an exercise in concentration and car control. The ZL-1 represented the absolute peak of 60s muscle car insanity. Maximum power in a chassis that could barely contain it, sold to anyone with enough money and courage. Today, they're worth millions and are among the most valuable muscle cars ever built. But in 1969, they were just race cars with license plates, machines that separated the skilled from the survivors and proved that sometimes Detroit built cars that were too fast for their own good. These 12 machines represented the wild, unregulated peak of American automotive performance. They were built in an era when power mattered more than safety, when cubic inches were king, and when survival depended entirely on driver skill. The insurance companies eventually caught up, rating these cars as uninsurable for young drivers. The government stepped in with emissions and safety regulations that strangled performance. And the oil crisis of the early 70s made big block engines economically unviable. But for one glorious decade, Detroit built cars that were genuinely dangerous, machines that could kill you as easily as they could thrill you. These weren't just fast cars, they were challenges, daring drivers to prove they were skilled enough to handle maximum power with minimum safety equipment. The 60s muscle car era represented a unique moment in automotive history when manufacturers competed to build the fastest, most powerful machines possible without regard for the consequences. The death toll was real. Thousands of young drivers died in muscle car accidents throughout the decade, but the legend endures because these cars represented something more than transportation. They represented freedom, power, and the belief that man and machine could push boundaries together. Which of these 60s legends would you be brave enough to drive at the limit? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories from the golden age, when muscle cars were raw, unforgiving, and absolutely magnificent, hit that subscribe button for more tales from the era when American iron ruled the streets and danger was just part of the price you paid for speed.